Welcome to another episode of Eavier than Metal. I know a lot of you have been waiting for the next episode, and I'm also glad it's finally edited and uploaded. For those that are not familiar with the series, it's basically supposed to be a masterclass on how to paint Games Workshop models if you want to push yourself a bit further than the general style of their painting studio. The limitation I'm setting myself is that it cannot take longer than 20 hours. Now, editing 20 plus hours of footage into something that makes sense as a YouTube video requires to make a few compromises, and not everything is going to be showed in full detail, but comprehensively. As always, I will upload the full tutorials as well as a PDF guide to my Patreon, so maybe you want to check that out. I 100% believe that it's worth it if you want to improve your painting. And if you hate it, you can delete your pledge before the end of the month and you won't even be charged. Now, my idea for how to paint this Imperial Fist originated 10 years ago when I was preparing a Golden Demon entry. This crude collector is a scavenger, picking up whatever he needs, crafting armor and weapons from it as he sees fit. The centerpiece was supposed to be the makeshift armor of the mount. It's made up out of distinct armor plates from different armies in the 40k universe. Among them a plate from an Imperial Fist, tank or a dreadnought. Maybe you recognize this model from another video. I kind of hate loose ends, and so I decided to finish this paint job. Basically, the last time I painted yellow was in fact that armor plate on my crude collector, and I have an idea of how I wanted my Imperial Fist to look, but no real idea of how to get there. So I started with Vallejo's flat yellow and applied a consistent base coat. Then I tried to come up with shade colors that would achieve the warm orange look I wanted to end up with. However, my first attempt, and you can see a lot of colors on my palette, didn't look all that great. So my first impulse was,
I'm gonna have to science the out of this.
Which means to put even more colors on the palette. What I was looking for was an interesting orange-brown. Painting the chest plate, I realized that what I need to do to get where I want it to be is to make my base color, or midtone in this case, darker, and I started off of this. I actually do believe that painting, and especially learning to paint, is problem solving. Where do you want to be and how do you get there? But there will be a follow-up video on this, so let's stay focused on the actual paint job. Applying a mix of flesh shade and orange yellow. In my case, I use Scruffulous Brown by Vallejo Game Color. You can substitute it by Saffron Sunset by Reaper, or even though I have not tried it, probably Avalanche Sunset by Citadel Colors. Then using Uriel Yellow on top of it sold me on this combination, and I applied my new base color to the whole marine. I did apply a selective wash of Rayclan Flesh Shade mixed with black to the very shadows, and gave the lower areas of the figure a filter of this mix as well, to darken them accordingly before I started to bring back light with Uriel Yellow. And so started a back and forth between applying highlights and bringing back intensity and shadows. But let's put this into more comprehensible visuals by doing this step by step on a smaller element, and then later look at the application on a more complicated highlight pattern. I did apply the flesh shade and scrofulous brown mix again and shaded the darker areas with the flesh shade and black mix. Scrofulous brown looks rather dark on the palette, but it works as my first highlight color, and I sketch in all the areas I want to be light and pay special attention to the edges. This takes a few layers to get consistent coverage, but we can employ this fact to our benefit and create gradients with only one or more semi-opaque layers. I'm also applying bounce lights and secondary reflections at this point to create an interesting reflection pattern. Next up, I add a bit of Imperial yellow and do the same, but I cover less and less area to create my gradients. This is a very fluid, on-the-fly approach, and as you get more proficient at glazing and layering, you will understand how much you are supposed to cover and in what opaqueness. I do recommend my layering and glazing video at this point. And there you have it, a simplified palette, and I also put up all the names of the colors I used to create the yellow on the armor. I do add more and more Imperial yellow and eventually end up with the last highlights of Fleshkit's yellow. This gives us both warm orange-brown shadow colors and a rich yellow. So here's an example of more complicated reflection patterns using the same colors. On top of the base mix, I apply layers of Scrofulous Brown in 3 areas around the leg using the reflection pattern of a metallic cylinder. Again, paying special attention to the edges, especially the ones facing up. Highlighting these areas with Imperial yellow, I'm also showing a few different areas and how I sketched in the light there accordingly. Focusing on the face a bit, I do create sharp contrasts to make it a focal point for the eye. The last step is of course to put in small amounts of Flash Kids yellow before moving into shading with some Wrinklefish again, showing a much lighter surface as another example of contrast as well. Doing the black parts, the focus was again to create high contrast, interesting reflections, keeping the black surface but going up to white. I like to mix in ice yellow to my blue and black base mix because it creates an interesting blue that works as a mid-tone for my endeavor. I am applying this blue in a pattern that is credible to the shoulder pad trims, and I start highlighting the chest eagle as well. I felt my blue was lacking a bit, so I mixed in a bit of denim blue by Reaper. And then I'm gradually adding more and more ice yellow, gradually building the light on the eagle's wings and the skull. Eventually, I am also adding shadows by mixing some dark sea blue and black and applying a selective wash to the recesses before reapplying some light where needed. To maximize contrast, I do add some light dots in strategical places using white. For the steel parts, I used the same base color. I just made sure that my midtones take up more space, which is interesting because both the black and the steel non-metallic metal have ultimately been painted with the same colors. The beauty of painting these small metal parts and non-metallic metal is that you can quickly create intriguing high contrast details that become real eye catchers. Again, I used the same colors as before to paint the barrel of the bolter, just switching around the pattern of highlights towards a cylindrical shape. For the casing of the bolter, I used Mephiston Red. The fact that it doesn't have one pass coverage over black can be used to create the gradient by selectively applying layers. So I covered the areas I wanted lighter with 1 or 2 layers more before I moved into highlighting some areas and especially the edges by mixing in more and more Phoenix Red by Reaper. For the black parts I used the base mix of blue and black again, mixing in more and more ice yellow. When this was done, I realized that my red needed a bit more contrast, so I glazed in a few more layers of pure black towards the upper edge. Coming back to the red, I added a bit of pure Phoenix Red to the edges of the casing and eventually also added some icy yellow, which resulted in an interesting salmon highlight color that looks intriguingly like light bouncing off an edge of a red item. For the Aquila again, I used the same colors as for the other metal parts, starting a bit darker but making sure to put enough focus on all the edges. In the end, I added a light reflection that covered the width of the eagle's wings on both sides. And sometimes when you're going really bright on a highlight, you do realize that some other elements need to be brought in line, so I went back to the barrel of the gun, some of the details on the black, and brought them higher up. Usually these last highlights I do dab on, I don't make them consistent. That simulates that, these edges are worn and just catch light selectively. I painted the ammo clip in the same non-metallic metal colors again. I still kept the footage in, albeit the fact, but speeding it up so that you can still see the highlight and reflection patterns. While I had a blue-gray highlight color on the palette, I quickly focused on the connective parts of the armor. I touched these up to a medium gray, sometimes going a bit lighter the higher up they were. The letter started out as a base mix of Rhinoxide and English uniform. Conveniently, it made sense to start the purity seal in English uniform as well, and highlight it up by mixing in more and more icy yellow. Gradually highlighting the letter towards pure English uniform and eventually adding more and more icy yellow. I focused on the edges here. Eventually I did add more and more dots and lines as texture to mimic wear and tear and scratches. I decided to paint the freehand specialty marking and chapter badge on the shoulder guards. Starting with the specialty marking on the right guard, I first painted the middle line of the arrow so I had the length marked, and then did the same for the width. From there on I slowly painted the arrow outwards until it had the right size. What gave me the most trouble was getting the corners sharp, but I knew I could later touch them up with yellow. I didn't just want the arrow to be black, that would also look odd since it curves down and the light situation changes, so using my highlight colors for the black parts, I added a gradient mimicking the yellow gradient below. Like I said a few minutes ago, I wanted to clean up the edges of the arrow. This is necessary because the very tips are hard to get sharp because of the way that brushes are shaped, and also because the highlights make the border area a bit fuzzy, if the black lower layers still show especially. While I could use some Imperial yellow for the upper side, I had to mix some of the darker base color for the lower edge. The whole marine looks a bit too polished at this point, so I decided to add a few scratches and imperfections to the freehand. I mixed a few of the armor's colors so I could adjust the hue of the yellow according to where on the freehand they would be placed in relation to the curve of the shoulder pad. Scratches should be thin but irregular, and chips should have sharp edges in order to look credible. Next I started on the chapter badge freehand. I did mix a base color of blue and black and mixed in a good amount of drying retarder. That way I can wipe away mistakes with a wet brush without ruining the gradient below. Little did I know that I was going to draw an almost perfect circle in one go. Oh well, better safe than sorry, I guess. I'm putting a dot in the center of the circle because I know it will be covered by the fist, and it helps me to plan where the rest of the lines of the freehand go. After the outlines are done, I paint in the markers for the diamonds in the circle. I don't mind that there is no clear separation between the circle and the diamonds, and also they're not super refined yet, because I will correct the lines again later. After filling in the shape in black, I'm painting the details. First I painted in the desaturated gold trims because they help me with making sure that all the elements are in the correct place. Then using the highlight colors for the black trims, I'm adding highlights and shadows to the freehand, which makes the shape appear out of the chaos that it is now. Smoothness isn't really important here. In this scale, contrast is what counts, so I'm going up to white on the reflections. And I put the same highlights on the diamonds, varying the intensity depending on how far up or down they are. I also put the light reflection on the circle. In this case, I only put one on the upper edge of the top part and one on the upper edge of the lower part. I really couldn't be bothered anymore to hold my breath constantly at this point, and also time was running out. But mostly I was stressed out at this point, I won't lie. The other freehand 10 years ago was about twice as large. So I painted the edge in denim blue and I mixed in white for a single highlight. Last, I cleaned up the area around the diamonds with the correct shades of yellow. Now, only a few details were left to do. The wax part of the purity seal was painted in Mephiston red, highlighted with Phoenix red. I left some black for the shadows. I painted the eyes black when I was done with the armor to clean them up again. I thought blue would be an interesting color to go with the yellow, and I already had so much blue in the black areas, it kind of felt suitable. I used the navy blue mixed with black for the first layer, gradually adding more and more mint green by Reaper. Then gradually added more white and painted the eyes like lenses with the colors facing down and getting lighter as they progressed outwards. Putting white dots to mimic a reflection in the top opposite corner rounded out the illusion. Another small detail that was left to do was the scribbling on the purity seal. After I measured out where the feet of the Marine would go on my plinth, I glued on a few blobs of milliput to the wood. Originally I wanted to construct a stone structure that had a few isolated stones on a simple black base, but then I changed my mind and placed the stones a bit denser and without much space in between. I sculpted all the stones and tried to create chipped stone textures with my standard sculpting tool. You can check the video about what tools I use for sculpting in one of my earlier videos to see how to make your own. You can experiment with drying times as milliput changes its properties over the course of its curing period. As per usual, I used real-life earth sprinkled over with superglue as filler material and eventually sprayed everything black. I just realized that I was using the same color mix for my leather parts, Rhinoxide and English uniform for the base colors here, but that doesn't matter, it changes color so many times during the painting process. What follows is a few layers of different brown and red tones highlighted with beige. In the beginning I tried to paint some of the detail by hand, highlighted edges by hand, but time was ticking, so I switched to dry brushing halfway through, which also looks fine in the end. Applying washes of browns mixed with black for the shadows and washing the stone structures with red browns and yellow browns gives me a deep color, and alternating highlights increases the contrast. After this was done, I decided I wanted to have richer colors for the dust between the stones, so I applied pigments again, starting from a darker brown, almost red. I carefully dabbed the pigment on with an older soft brush. You can see that some of the base was still wet, which usually takes away the dusty look of pigments, but it's okay, it was just the first layer. Following up the darker red-brown, I switched to a pigment similar in hue but lighter. Swiping away some of the pigment that got stuck on the rock areas so that the colors of the rock don't get obscured in the end. You will be able to see in the later footage that I decided off cam to add a third, almost dark yellow pigment variation into the recesses of the stones to make everything appear even more dry and deserted. All that's left to do is now to glue the miniature together and mount it on the base. After the miniature was glued together, I felt like a little detail was still missing, so I took some of the seaweed I keep around for quick dry grass effects. I took a diluted wash of a suitable brown and colored the center of the tuft to make it appear darker. Thanks for watching until the end. I appreciate every single one of you. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section. Don't forget that if you liked the video, to leave a like and share the video with your friends. It helps a lot. Don't forget that all patrons can post work in progress of finished miniatures on the Discord server for feedback by me and our great community. And you will get to see all YouTube content, typically 10 to 14 days earlier depending on when I finish editing the videos. My upload schedule will now be one video every other Friday, in addition to the usual Patreon content. And the Monday streams will continue in January. This video has been brought to you by these guys on the left that have already generously decided to support my content on Patreon. Thanks a lot guys, I couldn't do this without you.